So greetings and welcome everyone to our monthly book discussion. And today we are discussing an edited volume by Rano Turaeva and Rustamjon Urinboyev. Rano kindly joined us today. And the title of the book goes like this. It's on labor, mobilities, informal practices in Russia, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe. I'll briefly introduce myself. My name is Nodira Kholmatova. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Amsterdam Institute for Social Science Research, where I work in a team on return migration and reintegration governance on a global scale. And today we are also joined by Dr. Dina Sharipova. And I would like to take a moment to introduce our author and the discussant. I'll start with Dr. Rano Turaeva, who is a senior scholar affiliated with the Institute for Social and Cultural Anthropology at the LMU in Munich in Germany. And she is also an associated senior researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Halle, Saale in Germany. Dr. Turaeva has written on migration, entrepreneurship, informal economies, gender, border studies, identity, and interethnic relations, among many other topics. Her work has been published in such genres as Central Asian Survey, Inner Asia, Communist and Post-Communist Studies, and Anthropology of the Middle East. Thank you, Rano, for joining us. And our second discussant is Dr. Dina Sharipova, who is an assistant professor at the Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan. Her research interests include nation and state building, security issues, formal and informal institutions, civil society, social capital, and well-being in Central Asia. Her recent publications include a book on state building in Kazakhstan, Continuity and Transformation of Informal Institutions, published by Lexington Books in 2018. So please have a look. She also has a number of publications in scholarly journals, such as Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, Europe and Asia Studies Journal, Nationalism and Ethnic Politics, Central Asian Survey, Nationalities Paper, and others. Currently, Dina is a member of the editorial board on Central Asian Survey. And thank you, Dina, for joining us as a discussant today. I will briefly mention the format of the discussion. We have only 1 hour, so each discussant, me and Dina, will take up to 10 minutes maximum to summarize some key points from the chapters that we have read, because the volume is very big, right? It has 3 sections, and each section is on labor and its mobility, on informality. So we had each chapter to discuss. And then Rano will have also up to 10 minutes maximum to address the questions, and then we'll open the session with the audience. So I will give the floor to Dina now, so I can stop talking, and then I'll continue after her with my own questions. Dina, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Nodira. Thank you so much, Rano and Asil, who probably can join us later for this invitation to participate in this discussion of the book. I think that it's a very interesting piece of work. It's an edited volume related to mobility and informality. And I think that this book opens kind of a new venue by focusing on the interaction between informality and mobility regimes within this new mobility paradigm. And in fact, we can think that so far a lot has been written about formal and informal institutions and different survival strategies that people apply when they try to adapt to new environments. However, I can of course say that this volume provides a different angle on how people, different ideas, objects move around and interact with the local context, state authorities, agencies, etc. What is interesting is that this volume explores on how people navigate their daily life and what survival strategies they use. And the chapter that I was asked to comment on is related to the access of oral monks, people who came to Kazakhstan in the post-independence period from different countries, how they gain access to medical services in rural areas. So this chapter is ethnographic research of a rural hospital located in a small village in the eastern part of Kazakhstan. The scholar says that Kazakhstan is a paradigmatic case in mobility leading to new informal practices. The authors Bakit Muratbayeva and Benjamin Kwazinovsky provide a very detailed account of different informal practices of the so-called paperless oral monks. So again, it's those people who returned to Kazakhstan during the post-independence period. Why they are paperless? Because despite the fact that they have kind of, legal status, but they still have not received documents, and thus they, according to the title of oral months, they are entitled to this document, but they still have illegal status. So what I liked about this chapter is that the authors provide some kind of overview of the Soviet period and the development of medical institutions on the territory of Kazakhstan. They argued that such events as revolution, World War II spurred large migratory flows of medical workers to Kazakhstan, as well as other social groups representing collective experience of mobility. So it's not like, focus on one individual who comes, but it's like how people collectively experience this mobility. And they argue that different events, we know that such as, for instance, collectivization, decolonization, relocation of people, they also contributed to this large migration of people on the territory of the former Soviet Union. And the result of those experiments, Soviet social experiments, as well as migratory flow, has been, of course, the creation of multi-ethnic Kazakhstan. And what is interesting that authors also argues that when analyzing this rural area, this particular village, the Kızıljar village, they argue that this heterogeneous composition of this rural area also is projected or translated into the heterogeneous composition of the hospital, because their focus was on the hospital, ethnographic research of the rural hospital. So the authors argue that there were different experiences of the people who migrated during the Soviet period and during the post-independence period. And they make a comparative analysis of these different collective experiences. So the post-independence immigrants, the oral months, who compose 1/3 of the village's population, mostly came from Uzbekistan, Karakalpakstan, and Xinjiang region. And these people, these new immigrants, are in stark contrast to the established local community. So basically, the authors make this difference between those, oral months who arrived and the established communities, people who lived on this territory for a long time. So the idea is that this configuration of outsiders, so oral months who came to the territory of Kazakhstan, and established communities, those people who lived for a long period of time, is reflected in the composition of the hospital. So they also talk about unequal access to prestigious positions. So basically, oral months usually occupy lower positions. They belong to the lower strata of the society, and compared to the established communities. And especially it is related to the paperless oral months, those who do not have legal status, and which is paradoxical. So the authors also discuss the term oral months, and they say that it has over time, it changed its meanings since 1994 when it was introduced. And again, today oral months have some kind of pejorative connotation. So as I said, the focus is on the access to healthcare services. And I mentioned that Nodira mentioned that I also published a book in 2018 where I also talked about the access of people in Kazakhstan to medical services, to the provision of healthcare. And I made comparison between rural and urban population. In this work, the authors talk about these, newcomers, the migrants, and their problems to access medical services in Kazakhstan. One of the issues was the introduction of electronic database. You know that Kazakhstan is now kind of, obsessed with digitalization. We try to introduce electronic databases everywhere in agriculture, in healthcare. And so this electronic database created certain problems for the paperless oral months to get access to medical services. So because, database controls very strictly who are entitled to these services, people who don't have legal status, they cannot get these medical services, so they're excluded. So it became very difficult for the oral months to bypass these official regulations, and the healthcare providers are not able to do that easily as they did it before. So I want to emphasize that the author say that these oral months, they received some help from the medical providers, although they were not entitled to. But with the introductions of electronic database, it has become even much more difficult to get access, but still these, healthcare providers, medical workers in these hospitals, they continued to give them services, despite that it is not allowed by the state. So basically what we see is that there is kind of paradox that despite the introduction of digitalization, informal practices continue to exist. And also shows that the introduction of this electronic database have not changed anything in terms of strategies of survival and informality for both groups. So there is kind of gap or discrepancy between official regulations and actual provision of services. The informality, however, is not a good thing according to the authors, because it can be very arbitrary, because healthcare providers can choose to whom they can provide this service or to whom they can deny it. But on the other hand, we can say that, okay, so it might be arbitrary, plus it might also increase inequality in the population, right? Because not all people can have access to these services. And eventually it might serve as a barrier to the integration of oral months to the local community. On the other hand, we also can talk about the ethical dilemma that was created by this situation, because now medical providers are they face challenge whether they should provide some medical assistance to these people, to this illegal oral months or paperless oral months, or they have to follow the official legislative regulations, right? So the authors, for instance, argue that the established communities view outsiders of these oral months as culturally and socially inferior to themselves. To be honest, I had some difficulties to agree with this statement, because to me it was not necessarily about inferiority rather than violation of state regulations. So maybe healthcare providers, they face this dilemma, which is about provision or performing the duty as a doctor and providing some help, assistance to the people. And on the other hand, it's a duty to the state to follow the regulations. So I think that maybe we can reflect on this. So I really enjoyed this article, but I have got some unanswered questions that I would like to pose, and maybe we can discuss more on those issues. So in particular, it was not clear for me what causal mechanisms are behind the persistence of informality. So scholars talk about that these informal practices continue to exist, that medical providers continue to give medical assistance to these paperless oral months, despite the introduction of this electronic database, despite the digitalization. So why, despite the introduction of this electronic database or new regulations, state regulations, the informal practices are going on? Maybe there might be some other mechanisms. Maybe there might be some social networks created across the oral months or outsiders and established communities that help to enforce and endure those informal practices. So the question would be, what are those factors and mechanisms that support informal practices, and might not be related only to medical sphere, but in general, Rano, to this topic, that you're discussing. Second, we know that digital technologies are introduced to reduce corruption and improve efficiency of state agencies in different fields, right? And this is like a very good intention. And in Kazakhstan, we observe that corruption has been reduced because we decrease the face-to-face contact between, let's say, state authorities and the people, which also contributes to the reduction of corruption, informal practices. So interaction has become very impersonal between the state and citizens. So, however, we also observe, and it was written by scholars, that new technologies, including digitalization, have brought new challenges for oral months and maybe other social groups to gain access to different state services, including medical services. So, in your opinion, how to strike a balance between technologies which improve state society interaction and government efficiency on the one hand, and at the same time marginalize some categories of citizens? What policy changes should be made to include those groups? Another issue is that can those informalities endure if, for instance, in case of the oral months, their status can change? So maybe these people don't have access to medical services because their status is different. But can we say that when they change the status, then informalities can be just, can just disappear, right? And actually, the question would be, is it possible at all to get rid of these informalities by improving legislation, by improving regulations, by introducing new laws? Or we always have to live within this, interaction of formal and informal? So I guess I can say that there have been many informal practices, and most likely their level has been reduced to the electronic database among the established communities. And it would be great to make a comparative perspective what the level of informality is among the established communities and those who have arrived recently. So it's not maybe interesting only to see how this informality has been changed or not among the communities that came to the territory of Kazakhstan, but also, within these established communities, people who live very long. And another point that I wanted to make in terms of external validity. So since this piece is ethnographic, and it's very fascinating piece because it really was able to find out, discover lots of interesting insights, would it be possible to extend this explanation to urban areas? Because the focus was on rural areas. Can we say that there are differences in terms of mobility and informality across rural versus urban areas? Or are they similar, or are they different? And how they are different and how they are similar? So these are the questions that I would like to pose, Rano, and maybe we can also discuss together. Thank you.
Thank you, Dina, very much. This is very well done discussion. Thank you. I will take the turn, and since you already did an amazing job by presenting the idea of the book, I think I will just focus on the key takeaways that I got from the book and from reading the introduction and the chapter by Sherzod Yeraliyev and Anna-Lisa Husela on Central Asian female migrants, transnational social spaces, with a very promising title on straddling illegality and tradition. I would like to pose a few questions about the introduction and then go to discussing the chapter. Rano, I was just curious because it's a big edited volume, it has 3 different sections. Very general question, in compiling such edited volume, what were the main criteria in selection of the papers that allow you to synchronize them within these big conceptual topics, right? And like Dina already mentioned, all of them contain empirical infographic data, right? And following on the point on ethnographic data, I wanted to also say that the book, the parts that I read and the content that I reviewed focuses on these interlocking and intersecting processes, right? And uses concepts of mobility, informality, uncertainties throughout the whole book, right? And these categories of practice in this book predominantly are discussed, and they produce vulnerabilities that the actors negotiate. The actors have to negotiate their positions, right, in relation to be the state or different institutions, right? So my question is here in relation to this, what about the category of analysis? By looking at all these case studies across all these countries, right? What were the commonalities and differences that could have already be drawn, or it's an idea for the next book or the next researcher working on the topic among all these case studies? They would allow you to theorize about informality and uncertainty from this very bottom-up approach, and also to for the future research to avoid conceptual misconceptions. So when we say informality, when we say labor migration or mobility or uncertainty within this region that you're covering, what are the misconceptions to avoid, or which are the concepts should be used, for example? That would be the key takeaways for the researchers, right? And I would like to now to briefly discuss Shirzod and Annalisa's paper. I also did my PhD on gender migration in Tajikistan, and I can see a lot of commonalities in what I've observed in the field as well. And the paper discusses a drawing on the interviews with 4 female migrants from Tajikistan and Uzbekistan in Moscow and migration lawyers. The chapter examines the transnational social spaces of Central Asian female migrants in Russia and poses 2 key questions. What are the peculiarities of female migrant experiences within the Russian legal system? And how do national traditions in the home society influence the choices of the female migrants in the host society? To answer these 2 questions, the authors discuss what might lie behind the female experiences of legality and illegality in Russia, and how perceptions of local culture and traditions in the sending societies affect migrants' coping strategies in the recipient society. So many questions, through analysis of the life stories of 4 female migrants, the chapter discusses various obstacles and situations or circumstances that women migrants ended up, and so they try to analyze the life stories, specifically focusing on legal precarity for migrants, and in this case for female migrants. And they have very thick theoretical literature review across the world, actually, which is very good contribution, I would say, to show that there have been studies and theories about female migration, on gender migration out there. But what I found problematic is the lack of this nuanced theoretical approach into structural conditions and system of oppression that actually affects all the migrants, not just the female migrants. And here I felt like women migrants were like compartmentalized as a specific group of migrants that has been undiscovered or under research, which is not the case. There have been many papers on this. And I think by compartmentalizing female migrants and just focusing on them, they actually miss out a very important understanding of migration process, that men and women in migration, they're codependent, right? And the stories actually show it, that women end up in certain vulnerable situations because of certain relationship with the man or with the husband, with the partner, right? So just focusing on female stories, I feel like the chapter is missing out the family context, the community context, what's going on there in Moscow with these women migrants. It's not identified, it's not discussed in the chapter, which I think was something to be mentioned. And what's more important, I guess, conceptually, the authors talk about transnational social space, and transnational social space is not fully defined, unfortunately, but it draws on the literature on transnational migration, meaning that migrants commit to 2 different spaces, meaning in a country of origin and country of destination, and by communication, by keeping the social and economic remittances, they commit to these spaces, right? And they keep being mobile, meaning having transnational connections, having transnational social capital in both countries. Yet when they argue in the chapter that women, specifically female migrants, do not really fit into the transnational social space in Russia, what does it actually mean? It's a bit hard to follow in the chapter. And I think that part needs to be slightly clarified in the future if they feel like following up on this chapter. And for those of us who study Central Asian region in regard to gender and migration, I feel like chapter does not really say anything outside the normative identities of women and men, meaning that, I mean, we observe it on a daily basis. We read a lot of papers. And the basic migration theory is that when women and men are exposed to a different culture by daily interaction, by daily work activities, they tend to have more experiences. So their agency in relation to obstacles they face, their agency towards the informality, etc., also changes, transforms their identities, right? So what are other sides of their identities apart from being a woman who is a wife or a mom? Unfortunately, is not described well in this chapter. And I think that doesn't do the justice for the women migrants, because if we're talking about migrants, we also need to think, where do they work? How long do they work? How much they earn, etc., right? But the chapter predominantly focuses on very normative traditional idea of being a woman from Central Asia. Another analytical problem is a migration scholar I find, which I guess good to show in this chapter so that other scholars can avoid that in the future, is a homogenization of a category of female migrant. Homogenization meaning like there is no differentiation by age, which rural area they come from, which city they come from, because like Dina said, rural-urban difference is a huge important category in analysis of the population inside and outside Central Asia. And also the I would like to problematize the victimization of the women. Yes, it's quite common, we read it on the news. We have neighbors who have been migrants who ended up in vulnerable situations, but that's not the whole story, right? There are other parts of the stories that show how people overcome those vulnerabilities, right? In most of the stories they mentioned, the chapter focuses on specific law-related vulnerable moments, but kind of omits what were they doing before and what happened to them afterwards. Which would allow us as readers to see the full picture instead of just a momentum where the woman ended up in a precarious law-related situation, right? That would allow the authors actually to avoid the victimhood of the female migrants. And also by focusing on their age background, which rural urban area they come from, how many children they have, level of education, prior work experience, would have allowed to avoid this homogenization of the category of female migrants, to theorize the category of female migrant better, for instance. And I think while reviewing all the literature they have reviewed, and I've read them myself as well, as a contribution to gender migration and law kind of theory, I think we as Central Asian scholars and scholars in general, we have to be very careful not to replicate and reinforce binaries, meaning men and women, the way they're categorized in the literature. I think there's momentum to be careful and to be able to look beyond normative categories that are there, right? And the field of migration studies, especially in Russia, is full of examples where men and women, they step out from their traditional roles and things they have to do to make a living, to coexist. There are plenty of examples. However, unfortunately, in this chapter, they were not really focused on or shown. Overall, I think the chapter is a very interesting example on focusing specifically on female migrants. For those of us who want to, of course, I invite everyone to read it and to see the examples, but at least at the same time be critical about how categories are framed and what contexts are they used, so that we don't generalize and we don't homogenize the category of female migrants. Thank you. I will stop here. And Rano, I will give the floor to you. You have up to 10 minutes to, since there are so many questions, you have a privilege to pick up the ones that you like to answer, or the ones you found the most interesting to answer. And then we will open the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nodira. Thank you very much, Dina, for very exciting questions and discussion. I hope that we will have a very active and lively discussion, because you raised really very important questions. But I will not, and by the way, thank you that you raised an interest in our book, which we are really proud of. So I don't think that we do justice to the authors that are. I don't think they're present in our audience to discuss their works. Without them, I think that would be not so much productive or constructive. But I can maybe address some of the maybe critique that was raised regarding the chapters. And the forefront, I should say that we didn't also take the freedom to dictate any kind of frameworks or analytical frameworks that have been proposed within the chapters, but of course we propose the outline. So I will start with Nodira's comment, because she raised some important points to the introduction as well. So I start with Nodira's comments first, because I first obviously have to explain the idea of the book and the outline of the book and the aims behind this book. So the whole book started actually in Astana, Dina, in the workshop where we were discussing migration topics, and I myself did a lot of studies on informality, informal economies mainly, informal practices within state offices as well in Uzbekistan. So I'm coming with a background on informal economies, state practices of informality and migration. So when sitting and discussing about migration issues, I very shortly got into the literature on mobilities and these discussions of mobility turn with by Uri, that we entered the period where our concepts don't work anymore, because the concepts or frameworks become more flexible and more we cannot explain things because they're changing too quickly, and everything is mobile, including the ideas and everything. That's after the post-transnationalism discussions. That was again the background of my thinking, that when thinking about these things and mobilities in general, not talking about only migration, but mobilities in general, mobilities of ideas, mobilities of things, mobilities of everything, and thinking about informality. My idea was that what can bring us thinking about informality, the link between informality and mobilities. So we came together with Rustam in our further discussions about the same idea, and Rustam and I organized the workshop in Lund because he is interested in the legal aspects of migration, particularly migration from Central Asia to Russia and Turkey lately. So we both had similar interests. So we invited very, very different authors and scholars in Lund, and we discussed very, very also different ideas. Then I had primarily was trying to focus on the link between informality and mobilities in general. So at the end, after the event itself, I still insisted to systematically look into the link between informality and mobility, because it was interesting for me when here, particularly when people, not other things, but of course when people move, other things also move, including the ideas and identities or whatever you can imagine. So whenever people move, they leave their safe homes and safe networks and establish locales and cross different boundaries, and uncertainty is surrounding everywhere. So that why uncertainty came, and then informal practices, because these structures, wherever they are, if we're talking about one country, if we're talking about several countries, these infrastructures are not all able to manage these mobilities. If we talk about refugee crisis, if we talk about migrations, if we talk about seasonal migrants or migrations, whatever, I'm just generally talking about mobilities. So infrastructures, I mean the national infrastructures, or whatever infrastructures, wherever, they are not always capable of capturing all this mobility. And what happens is that somehow people have to organize their plans. They have to organize their living, their moving, making money and whatever. They have all kinds of projects. So they have to organize, and if these infrastructures cannot accommodate all of that, there is, of course, the, we talk again, going back to agency, of course, people innovate, people find the ways, people have the networks. If there are not enough networks, they create new ones, whatever. Innovative potential of human being, I mean, we don't have to be psychologists for that. So obviously, informality is always there where these infrastructures cannot accommodate so much of happening, whatever happening. So that was a basic ideas that we had to think about. And all these ideas, of course, need examples. And I agree with Nodira's critique that it's so many chapters, it's so many very different materials. I mean, this is not only even one region, we even have Germany as a case study. So we needed more diverse examples to show how these existing infrastructures there, if these are migration infrastructures, if these are legal infrastructures, there are all kinds of infrastructures. So whatever is there, legal systems or state, any kind of systems, who could not manage this kind of, if this is migrants coming from Poland to Germany, if they couldn't manage all that, there is always some kinds of institutions created or orders created. And we needed so much diverse examples of all kinds of situations of this. So basic idea is that when people move, when they leave their safe spaces, there is a precarity, there is uncertainty. We go to Butler a bit because she is kind of, her thinking about precarity is connected to state practices of abuse and how precariousness is created in this regard. But we didn't very much offered very well thought definitions. My critique would be maybe, but we wanted to somehow grasp this precarity and uncertainty, because my own interest was that uncertainty is not always on the side of the victims who are uncertain about certain things, but uncertainty is also used as a capital by other actors who try even to create more uncertainty because they use uncertainty as capital. Let's take the example of the police officers who would like to have illegal migrants so that they can get some money for their uncertain statuses and uncertain. Because when you are uncertain, when you feel uncertainty, you're vulnerable, and when you're vulnerable, you can be abused. And for other actors, this is a capital. so they can use it and abuse it. So I don't talk more time on this. I hope that I tried to explain the whole idea of the book, and that's why, just to go to the structure of the book, that's why we gave much attention to uncertainty. So you have like the whole part on uncertainty, and we have then another part on the boundaries between legal and digital. These are more of Rustam's interest, because he's interested in how digital technologies are crossing over national boundaries, are creating transnational spaces which are which cross all kinds of boundaries. And this is also related to legal and what is legal. I myself very against those binaries. So to address the critique about the binaries, I'm very much against. You cannot define what is formal and what is informal. The boundaries always blur. Yeah. So we tried to look at the boundaries, what kind of boundaries exist, if it's digital, legal. So we devoted the whole part on this. And the third part, we devoted the Dina nicely discussed one of the chapters in this part. And this is on part of how state practices, or how state informal practices are dealing with this kind of mobilities. In this case, she discussed the case of Uralman and how they deal with the services on a very local level. So these are how the book is organized and the idea behind it. So just to briefly to Dina's questions, very interesting thinking about this digitalization and how we can, on the one hand, digitalization obviously is a positive thing, and why it's de facto is creating actually barriers for example, for Uralman accessing this the same services. Again, it goes back to if we in our discussion of digital boundaries and digital transformation, and in the other part of the book, we were discussing other examples of how people get connected through smartphones and how they create digital mahallas or neighborhoods. So this is something, another kind of perspective on technologies and digitalization and connection and communication. But what you are giving, or what is discussed in this chapter, is much more a different perspective of not digitalization, but in my eyes, it's more of a technology as a tool to control. Like we also wrote on the system of Chot, for example, and this is a part of this kind of practice if we look at it from this side. So that's why I'm not sure about this digitalization. And of course, this is like a sword with two ends, where on the one hand, digitalization means some kind of impersonality, as you also said, that there was less corruption because people didn't have to face each other and do other kinds of practices. But on the other hand, it excluded certain categories of people who were not included within the same system. So that's another question, of course, whom you include within the same system and who are excluded, of course.
Rano, I'm sorry to pause you here, but we have like 14 minutes to go. And I would like to invite the audience for the questions. Thank you.
We can discuss the rural-urban part also. Maybe there will be some questions on that. But thank you very much. Sorry.
So those who have a question, they can raise a hand or write in the chat box, and we can continue with the questions from the audience. While people are formulating the questions, for instance, I would like to ask a question that I prepared that's relevant to current circumstances. And I'll ask the question quickly, and I'll let the Akbota ask her questions after me. The question that I prepared was, you're definitely right. When people end up in vulnerable circumstances, right, where their rights are, be it a migrant or mobile person in different conditions, right, different actors. I was wondering whether you had a chance within your editorial team or with the authors to also draw some, especially in current situation with the Russian war against Ukraine, right, about the system of oppressions actually that creates the environment where men and women are treated differently, when people, men and women from different countries are treated differently, that but the system, if we think about Russian context, for instance, is one system, right? Have you had a chance to draw any arguments, conclusions on that? What can you say after reviewing all these cases about the system of oppression within which all of these case studies take place? It's I know it's an open-ended question and it's like open for reflections. I don't expect any ready-made answer for this, but it's a reflection, open for reflections. I may ask Akbota to ask her questions, and maybe you can take those two at once. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. My name is Akbota. I am a PhD student at the George Washington University. Thank you for the book, and thank you to discussant for great comments. I had a question about how like informal networks can be used for political reasons, or for political objectives. So if informal networks that emerge are like within this uncertainty are they exclusively focused on adapting to the new environment, to this uncertainty, to the lack of access, let's say, to formal institutions or formal services? Or can they be used to lobby or organize and mobilize people to change those institutional settings they are circumscribed into, and maybe like include those who are disenfranchised? Like if it could be used for, or if it is used, I'm just not too familiar with the situation, if it's used for political objectives.
Thank you. Rano, it's your turn to address the questions.
Thank you for very exciting questions. I think I will start with Akbota. She asked very interesting questions about networks. What I can say from my own fieldwork, if with concrete examples, I think, of course, there are all kinds of very different networks, if it's offline or online, different character, different kinds of organized differently for different purposes. Just to give the example from my own research in Moscow, where I was hanging around with all kinds of different people. There were, for example, not only those networks who served, for example, for entrepreneurship projects or employment projects or finding other services, but for example, those communities or groups who created some network within, who were all Muslims, for example, who regularly attended mosques, for example. They didn't only pursue whatever like survival strategies, as I said, but also there were some networks who were learning about Islam and promoting Islamic way of living and knowledge about Islam and where one can buy halal food, for example. So promotion of Islamic knowledge and Islamic way, for example. These were one of the other examples that are not only have to do with economic projects. As to a system of oppression, I mean, I don't think that we can say that Russia, for example, can be defined as one system of oppression. as I said, there are all kinds of tools. I mean, I'm a fan of Foucault's works, and in Foucault's works, power is very much defined as not like sitting in one kind of place or locale or institution, but it's everywhere, and there is a very diversity of forms which contribute to these kind of hierarchies. And if you talk about this kind of exclusionary practices of very different kinds of forms of regimes, again, to give just the concrete examples, I think there are very different forms of practicing maybe some kind of oppression, or I don't know, abusing some kind of precarious situations where maybe it's gendered also situations. Of course, my favorite example is deportation regimes. My own chapter within the same book with Izzat Amon on deportation regime, for example, how deportation regime works in Russia, where very diverse actors participate within the same regime, not only court judges or police officers who actually execute the decisions, but very, very different actors and very, very different institutions and very, very different means, both legal and illegal, within the same system. So I'm not very friend of defining things as a system, but it's very diverse and very flexible. So just to address at least some of the aspects of the same things that you raised, which are very important actually, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Rano. I was actually referring to your chapter as well. And if I may just continue on this line, I read a quote, right, where you say, the contradictory elements within Russian law that is used to establish a deportation regime in order to remove unwanted migrants. So it's across all the chapters that I reviewed on migration that quite often the system of profiling migrants, in this case, Russia, it could be any other countries of origin where there is a certain system of mistreating or treating differently citizens, right? I'm not saying Russia is the case, the only case, but I'm just bringing an example where migrants are profiled, documents are not there, they're detained, often their cases are not prosecuted justly, right? And they're deported. And this kind of mechanism is everywhere. In Europe, gazillions of cases when people are jailed and deported, it's easier way how to control and govern migration, right? It's of course inhuman. It dehumanizes migration process. That's why I use the word oppression, because in this mechanism that you describe in your chapter, you can see how migrants are treated, right? There's a sort of mechanism of sorting out the population and removing it from the context.
Yeah, thank you very much. Method of profiling is not very unique for Russia, of course. We see it in Germany or in everywhere. You can just name it, of course.
Rano, I guess I also would like to have maybe a short question. So can you please elaborate more on the concept of fluidity of mobility? And also, when you talk about the state, which is not the only actor, how do you define the state? I mean, state also can be composed of different actors, right? And so what is the state, right? And also, what are other actors might be involved that deal with, these issues of mobility and informality?
Thank you, Dina. It's a very important question about fluidity, and mobility is itself a very fluid concept, because obviously we cannot define it really or put it in any kind of Nodira used a very nice term, compartmentalization. It's also a very popular term. So we cannot just put it in any kind of shelf, and it's very fluid because it's changing, it's not graspable even. So in terms of fluidity, yeah, and the state is also. I'm not a fan of defining any concept, particularly state. So as we know, particularly in those places where legal or illegal or state, non-state, this kind of boundaries are very much blurred, and informalization level is much higher. There it's very, very difficult to define what is state and what kind of actors. You asked a very right question. I mean, in the same deportation regime, not only state actors participate. And I mean, my own, in my previous book on Uzbekistan, where I describe how personnel in police offices without uniform, how you call it, внештатные, the police officers or police personnel, внештатные is out of, how you translate it in English, it's out of personnel. Informal workers of the same state office, obviously, do this kind of very informal jobs of the same offices. So this kind of phenomena, I mean, so it makes you very, very much difficult to define any kind of office also. Yeah. So I don't
agree.
think that I can offer you any kind of definition.
Kind of operate with certain concepts, right? Because we have to still deal with them, and we have to define what is what and how one influences the other, right? Maybe this is also about some interdisciplinary differences, right? Like in political science, we try to define, you know, like we know that there are many definitions, but we have to be like, we have to come up with a particular definition of what state is, how do you disentangle it, what are the actors, you know. Probably in ethnographic research for anthropologists it's a different story, but probably it's quite fascinating if we try to combine these different, you know, approaches and try to kind of have this cross-disciplinary discussion.
But it's helpful.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you, Dina. It was a great set of questions. Unfortunately, time is up, and we will have to wrap up our discussion. It's been an hour. It was a pleasure. Thank you for everyone who joined us and for all the interesting questions. And thank you, Rano, for devoting your time and being there on behalf of the book. And we wish you all good luck. And yeah, have a